The depot in Dry Hollow stood plain against the Nevada Territory sky. Little more than a weathered platform, a single painted sign, and a scattering of boards that groaned each time the wind pressed through them. It was December of 1882, late afternoon, the kind of hour when the sun slid low but the cold only deepened. The air moved sharp as a blade, lifting skirts and coats, cutting through stockings, biting its way to the bone. Folks came and went in quick strides, faces turned down, collars pulled high. No one lingered unless they had to. And yet Eleanor Price stood waiting, her green travel dress pressed flat against her knees, the torn hem fluttering around her boots like a reminder of what she had lost. She had been there for hours, long enough for the platform to change its color as the light shifted, long enough for the depot agent to glance at her 3 times and then look away again, as though shame itself might be contagious. Her carpetbag hung heavy in her hand, no more than a few changes of clothing and a shawl that barely held back the air. But she clung to it the way a drowning soul might clutch driftwood. It was all she had left to call her own. The man who was supposed to take her had already come and gone. He hadn't needed more than a glance. Wide in the belly, sweat on his vest despite the cold. He had squinted once, muttered something about too mousy, won't even look me in the eye, and walked off before she found her voice. He didn't ask her name, didn't even pause to think of the money she had paid, the miles she had traveled, or the fact she had nowhere else to step. He dismissed her with less care than a man gives to a horse he decides not to buy. That was the moment the platform turned colder, not because the air had changed, but because she had. Heat burned at the edges of her eyes, but she would not let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of people who already saw her as something to pity. She stiffened her jaw until it hurt, crossed her arms over her chest, and forced herself to remain standing. She told herself it wasn't courage. She didn't have any of that left. It was simply the only choice left to her. Sit, and she would look beaten. Walk away, and she had nowhere to go. So she stayed where she was, the way a small tree might bend in the wind, but refused to snap. The depot agent gave her the news she already knew in his own way. A telegram had been received, the arrangement canceled. Said you weren't what he expected. Told us to send you back east. He didn't know that there was no back. The cousin who had raised her after she was orphaned had died in the diphtheria outbreak. The boarding house where she worked had closed. The matchmaker's office in Ohio had swallowed her last dollars with a polite smile. She hadn't bought herself a future. She had only purchased a rejection at a later stop. 3 hours she stood there, boots soaked through from melted snow, hands stiff, eyes fixed on a horizon she didn't truly see. Her insides felt hollow, scraped out by years of being told she was too quiet, too small, too plain for men who wanted laughter and brightness. She had no brightness left to give, but she refused to let this town watch her break. Not yet. That was when the wagon came. 2 mules drawing iron wheels that carved into the frozen ruts. The man on the bench seat wore a wool coat and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low. A rifle leaned against the wagon's side. He climbed down slow, rope coiled over his shoulder, a small list of supplies in his hand. He walked as a man walks, who has carried silence for years, deliberate even, not rushing, not inviting notice. He wasn't looking for company, but when his eyes found her, he paused. Ellie noticed the pause. Women always notice men, Not in the way of longing, but in the way one notices storms or wild dogs, something to be prepared for, whether good or ill. Yet he did not leer, did not cut her with the glance most men gave to gauge her worth. He only slowed, considered, and asked plain, "You waiting for someone?" Her answer caught in her throat. The word came out hoarse, almost broken. Was. He studied her another moment, then looked down the platform as if searching for someone else who might claim her. But the platform was near empty, and her carpetbag was still at her feet. His second question carried no judgment, only fact. Got somewhere to go? She could have lied. Could have claimed she had friends down the line or another ticket in her bag, but lies didn't build roofs. Lies didn't fill bellies. She swallowed and said the truest words she had left. "No." He nodded once, eyes flicking briefly to her bag. She braced herself for the look, the dismissal, the same turning away she had already endured. But he didn't turn. His next words were not cruel, not demanding, just steady. "You hungry?" The question hit harder than rejection had. Hunger had lived inside her long before that train. She lowered her gaze, whispered, "A little." He turned toward his wagon without flourish, set down the rope and the list, and said, "Come on then." He didn't ask her name. He didn't give his. He simply helped her into the back, steadying her with a gloved hand that was firm, not grasping. He handed her a blanket that smelled of pine and smoke. She settled against the sideboard, her heart pounding louder than the mule's hooves. The man who had passed her by had left her shivering on the platform. This man, unknown, plain-spoken, not smiling, not cruel, had given her the first thing she hadn't expected, a place to sit, warmth against her knees, and no demand in return. Eleanor Price didn't know then what it meant. She only knew the cold platform was behind her, and the road ahead was lined with snow. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, the knot in her chest loosened just enough for her to breathe. The wagon rolled steady over the frozen ruts, iron wheels groaning under the weight of mule and man. And still, Eleanor Price sat pressed against the corner board, clutching the blanket that smelled of smoke and pine. The platform was behind her now, the silence of that rejection fading into the distance, but the sound of her own heartbeat would not quiet. Each bump in the road jarred her ribs. Each creak of the wagon reminded her that she was not free, not safe, only carried along by the choice of a stranger. He hadn't asked her for anything, hadn't spoken beyond the words that lifted her from the platform. But she knew men didn't help without reason. She had heard the stories back east, the whispered truths that lived in boarding houses and laundry rooms, men who offered shelter but expected bodies as payment. She swallowed hard and forced her eyes to the passing trees, bare branches rattling like bones in the sharp wind. If this man demanded something, she thought she had no bargaining left to give. And yet, the way he had touched her hand to help her climb, solid and brief, not grasping, it unsettled her more than greed would have. She knew how to expect cruelty. She did not know how to stand against a gentleness that asked for nothing. The man himself sat upright on the bench seat, shoulders broad under the wool coat, reins held loose in his calloused hands. His hat brim cast shadow across his face, but when the wind shifted, she caught sight of his jaw, square and lined with a quiet that looked older than his years. He hadn't looked at her long, not even once since the wagon pulled away from the town, but she could feel that he noticed everything. The way her hands trembled when she pulled the blanket higher. The way she pressed her knees tight together, as if her body itself tried to make smaller space. He drove without hurry, mules steady. The road taken as though he'd walked it 1,000 times in silence. It meant, to him, the wagon was not just transport, it was routine, the slow rhythm of someone who had long ago made peace with solitude. Nathan Gley had not intended to bring anyone back with him that day. His list in his pocket was plain: hinges, salt, nails. He had meant to return home with nothing more than supplies to mend a cabinet hinge, a bag of grain for the hens, and perhaps a small sack of flour, if the price was fair. He had not spoken to anyone more than he had to since the fever took his wife 3 years earlier. Words had grown heavy, and the silence of his homestead had become easier than conversations that only opened wounds. He carved wood, fixed wagons, built tables when the townsfolk paid, and when they didn't, he kept to himself. He knew how to live with only his own shadow, and then, stepping from his wagon into the chill of the dry hollow depot, he saw her standing, not moving, not begging, just holding herself like someone had told her she was worth nothing. And she had believed it, but refused to fall down where they left her. He had seen that look before, years ago in another place, on another face. He remembered the way silence clung to people who had no safe place to put their fear. He remembered how much it cost to watch someone like that be left. That memory had guided his hand before his mind could argue. Still, as the mules carried them along the frozen trail toward his land, he kept his eyes forward. He did not want her to mistake his pause for pity or his wagon for promise. He only knew what his conscience could not allow, leaving her there. He had no plan beyond that. The boards rattled under their weight, snow dust rising with each wheel turn, and he wondered what it would mean come nightfall. He wasn't ready for her questions, though she hadn't asked any. He wasn't ready for her silence either, though he found he could bear it. There was steadiness in it, not sharp or accusing, only the kind of quiet that lived in people who had been told too often to speak less. He thought maybe he could abide such quiet. Ellie, for her part, sat with her chin tucked low, her lips pressed tight enough to ache. She wanted to ask his name, wanted to ask why he had helped her. But the words clung to her throat like stones. If she asked, and he answered with demand, she would have to face it. If she asked and he answered with kindness, she would not know how to trust it. Jan, so she stayed still, letting the blanket soak the warmth from her legs, letting the silence stretch until it seemed to fill the sky itself. Fear had always been loud in her chest, but beside this man, it softened, shifting into something she couldn't name. She found herself noticing the way he guided the mules with a low sound in his throat, the way his gloves were patched but neat, the way his shoulders leaned not in pride, not in slouch, but in the posture of someone who carried weight without complaint. She caught herself studying those things, and the realization startled her. It felt dangerous to notice a man's steadiness when her life had been built around avoiding the reach of men altogether. The road bent north, the light falling faster as the ridge swallowed the sun. The air grew sharper. Nathan tightened the reins, guiding the mules through a narrow gap where snow had drifted knee-high against the rocks. He could feel her eyes on him, though she tried to hide it. He did not turn, but he allowed himself one thought. She was not like the women who came to town laughing loud and painted bright, nor like his wife, who had been gentle but sure of herself. This woman, this quiet, mousy girl the miner had rejected, held her silence like a shield. And though she looked small against the boards, there was a strength in how she endured the cold without complaint, in how she met his brief questions with truth instead of plea. It stirred something in him that felt dangerous too, respect. By the time the wagon cleared the ridge, and the first smoke of his chimney rose in the distance, the silence between them was no longer the emptiness of strangers. It was something else, a pause that neither of them understood yet, but both of them felt. He had only meant to offer her a ride, a hot meal, maybe a bed for a night. She had only meant to survive until morning. But as the mules pulled them closer to the cabin, Nathan Gley and Eleanor Price carried with them more than supplies and silence. They carried the first fragile thread of something neither had expected, the possibility that being seen did not always come with a cost. The wagon ground to a halt in the hard ruts of the yard, the mules stamping once before settling quiet. Ellie drew the blanket tighter around her legs and stared at the cabin that rose plain and solid before her. It was a single-story log house, square against the snow, smoke curling steady from the chimney. To one side stood a barn, to the other a lean-to stacked high with cut firewood. The yard was swept clean, not with the neatness of pride, but the care of a man who kept order, even when no one watched. For a long moment she didn't move. Her fingers knotted tight in the blanket. She had stepped into strange houses before, kitchens where she worked, parlors where she cleaned, but this was different. This was not employment. This was shelter. And shelter always had a price. Her stomach twisted at the thought of what that price might be. Nathan climbed down first, his boots crunching hard in the frozen dirt. He unlatched the side rail, set his rope and list aside, then turned back toward her. His hand came up, not reaching, not demanding, just offered. She hesitated, eyes fixed on the calloused palm, then placed her own into it. His grip was firm, steady, and he lifted her down as though the act required no thought at all. "House is warm," he said simply, nodding toward the door. "You'll sleep in the front room. There's stew on the stove." His voice carried the same plainness it had on the platform. Nothing more than what needed saying. No warmth, no edge, just fact. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and ash, the kind of scent that lingers after years of wood smoke and polish. Ellie paused in the doorway, clutching her bag against her chest. The walls were lined with shelves of tools, tins, and carved bowls. A narrow bed stood made in the corner, another along the far wall, both plain but clean. The stove glowed faint with embers, giving off enough heat to ease the sting in her hands. She stepped in slow, her boots scuffing against the swept floorboards. The room felt lived in but not cluttered, ordered without being stiff. It was the kind of place where silence had made its home. Nathan crossed to the stove, lifted a ladle, and poured stew into a tin bowl. He handed it to her without flourish, only saying, "Sit, eat. We'll talk later." She lowered herself onto a chair near the fire, the steam from the bowl rising into her face. The first bite was awkward. Her hands shook, the spoon rattling against the tin, but the taste filled her chest with warmth she hadn't known in days. She ate slow, eyes lowered, only glancing at him when she thought he wouldn't notice. He noticed anyway, though he made no comment. Instead, he pulled a chair to the fire and began whittling at a length of wood. The scrape of the knife against cedar filled the silence, joined only by the crackle of flame. Ellie had braced herself for questions. Men always asked where she came from, what she could do, whether she was willing. But Nathan asked none of it. He sat across from her, the firelight cutting across the scar that ran along his collarbone, his hands moving slow, deliberate, shaping wood into form. He did not hurry her, did not press for words she wasn't ready to give. That unsettled her more than anything else. She knew how to protect herself from questions, from grasping, from cruelty. She did not know how to answer silence that asked nothing. That night, when her bowl was empty and her bones heavy with exhaustion, he pointed to the narrow bed along the wall. "Empty," he said. "You can have it. I'll take the other." She nodded, her throat too tight for words, and set her carpetbag down by the foot. She did not undress, only lay curled on top of the quilt with the blanket still around her shoulders. Her body was taut, every muscle braced for a touch that never came. Across the room, Nathan's movements stayed slow, each one deliberate, as though he weighed it twice before acting. He banked the fire, set the wood aside, and stretched out on his own bed without a word. Ellie kept her eyes open long after the cabin dimmed. She lay listening to the sound of his breathing, steady and unhurried. It was not the rasp of drink, nor the heavy rhythm of men who fall asleep without care. It was the sound of someone who lived by routine, who carried discipline into even his rest. Near dawn, when the cold crept back against the walls, she heard him rise, stoke the fire, and set another log inside. Still, he said nothing to her. He only stayed. Somehow that was harder to believe than if he had spoken vows. When morning broke pale and slow through the frost-touched window, Ellie rose stiff from the bed. Her muscles ached from tension, her eyes shadowed from half-sleep, but she stood anyway. Nathan was already outside. The thud of his axe striking wood carried in rhythm, steady, never rushed. She moved to the basins, flinched at the cold water on her skin, and stared at her reflection in the small wall mirror. The circles under her eyes, the torn seam at her hip, the loosened knot of her hair. All of it stared back at her, reminding her of how little she had left to offer. She turned from the glass before it could break her resolve. When Nathan came back in, his shirt damp from effort and his breath still visible, he set kindling by the stove and lit another fire. He glanced once at her, sitting upright at the table, hands folded in her lap. "You sleep any?" She nodded, though it wasn't true. "Good," he said. He poured coffee into 2 mugs and set one in front of her. "You can stay as long as you need." "I don't expect anything." The words struck like a blow she couldn't see coming. She blinked fast, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I don't have money," she whispered, "or work." He studied her, not coldly, not kind, just weighing the steadiness in her voice. "There's always work," he said. "Start with staying warm. Huh? After that, we'll figure it." And that was all. No demand, no bargain, just space enough for her to sit without apology. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Ellie Price felt the smallest crack open in the wall she had built around herself. She didn't know yet if she trusted him. She didn't know if she could. But as the fire caught and the coffee warmed her chest, she knew one thing. He hadn't lied. He had stayed. And that, for now, was enough. Morning settled into shape the way snow does. Slow, silent, covering everything without asking permission. By the time the second day at Nathan's cabin stretched long against the frost-glazed windows, Ellie found herself moving through its narrow rooms, not as a guest, but as someone who might leave a mark, however small. She had risen from the bed, careful not to disturb the steadiness of the house, folded her blanket, and stoked the fire with a practiced hand. Her body still hummed with the tension of a cornered animal, but the motions of labor, the stirring, the sweeping, the bending, were familiar enough to quiet her chest. Nathan returned from the barn with his gloves frosted white and his breath streaming in clouds. He stamped his boots, hung his coat, and gave her one look, a glance more than a word. "Coal," he said simply, and began laying wood in the stove. She answered only with a nod, but something in her steadiness caught his eye. He had expected her to remain folded on the bed, waiting for orders, or perhaps pacing with the restless eyes of someone too frightened to work. Instead, she had moved with quiet efficiency, as though she had already decided her survival depended on not wasting her hands. They began to fall into rhythm that way. Nathan took the axe to the larger logs while she stacked the smaller pieces near the stove. He fed the goats, grumbling under his breath at the mule's stubbornness, while she carried water from the pump, her boots sliding across the frozen yard. At first, they spoke only in fragments. "Careful with the pail. Shut the gate tight. Where should I put this?" But the silence between those words softened. It was no longer the heavy quiet of strangers, nor the brittle hush of judgment. It was the plain sound of two people working side by side. Ellie had lived her whole life with eyes down, hands quick, voice kept low to avoid notice. But here, in this yard, where the snow pressed its own silence into the earth, she felt the smallest shift. She wasn't being corrected, wasn't being hurried. Nathan did not bark when she moved slow, did not sigh when she stumbled on ice. He worked without commentary, steady as the ticking of a clock. And in that steadiness, she discovered she could breathe in longer drafts. She still carried her fear like a shadow, but it no longer pressed sharp against her ribs. Inside, the pattern repeated. She found the flour tin in the cupboard, the salted pork wrapped neat, the beans measured by habit. She cooked not with confidence, but with diligence, careful not to burn, careful not to waste. When she leaned to open the stove hatch, her dress pulled at the seam near her hip again, the thread tugging loose. Heat flushed her cheeks, shame biting at the thought of him noticing. But Nathan only turned away, reached for a flannel shirt hanging from a peg, and set it on the table. "That dress won't last. Wear this over it, warmer." His tone held no judgment, only fact. She slipped it on, the sleeves too long, the fabric carrying his scent of cedar and sweat. She did not speak of it, but her heart lodged heavy against her throat. Later, as the wind rattled the shutters, he brought out a small box of tools, fine knives, small blades, bits of sandpaper. He sat by the fire and pulled a block of cedar into his lap. She watched, hands folded around her knees until the silence broke her. "What are you making?" she whispered. His knife moved steady, shaving curls from the wood. "Hairbrush." Her fingers rose unconsciously to her own hair, knotted from travel, untouched for days. "For me?" He glanced up once, then back down. "Yeah." Gratitude and disbelief tangled in her chest. No one had made her something in years. Not since her aunt stitched her a shawl before the fever took her. She felt the weight of tears, fought them back, and sat in silence, watching the brush take form in his calloused hands. As days stretched, the rhythm deepened. She mended one of his torn shirts with thread from the small chest he offered her, each stitch a careful claim on space she did not yet dare call her own. He repaired the loose board on the porch while she swept the snow clear. They ate together at the small table, beans, cornbread, sometimes eggs from the coop. She moved slower in his kitchen, but he never hurried her. He noticed the way her shoulders softened when she folded laundry, the faint hum in her breath when she cooked. He said nothing, but he noticed. For Ellie, each act of labor steadied the ground beneath her. She had been tossed from place to place, always told she was not enough, too shy, too quiet, too plain. But here, silence was not punishment. It was allowed. She began to see herself not as a burden, but as someone whose hands could keep the fire lit, whose stitches could hold fabric together, whose care could bring order to a space. When she lay down at night, muscles sore from work instead of fear, she felt something she had not felt in years: usefulness. It did not erase the knot of doubt inside her, but it loosened it. Nathan, watching from the corner of his eye, felt a shift too. He had lived 3 years with silence as his only companion. It had been sharp at first, cutting him raw with every reminder of what he lost. Then it had become a blanket, heavy but familiar. Now the silence in his cabin had changed. It was no longer hollow. It was filled with the scrape of her needle against cloth, the soft sound of her steps across the floor, the clink of tin mugs against the stove. He found himself listening for those sounds, marking time by them. He did not admit it even to himself. But the house no longer felt empty. By the third evening, when snow piled thick against the windowsills and the wind howled low across the ridge, Nathan finished shaping the brush handle. He set it aside to cool in the fire's warmth. Ellie sat across the room, mending, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She glanced up, caught his eyes for the briefest moment, then lowered hers again. The silence that followed was not tense, it was waiting. And in that waiting, both of them understood what had begun. A rhythm not of survival alone, but of presence. Not spoken aloud, not yet trusted, but they are all the same. Two people, once abandoned by the lives they thought they would have, now shaping something steadier out of work, wood, and silence. The brush came to life slowly in Nathan's hands. The cedar block shaved down day after day until its shape curved smooth beneath his knife. Ellie had watched from across the fire each evening, never asking again, but always noticing. The way her eyes flicked toward the growing form, and then away as though she had no right to claim it. On the fourth night, when the snow pressed hard against the windows and the fire cracked steady in the stove, Nathan set the finished piece across his knee. The handle had been carved to fit a palm, the spine polished smooth, and wooden teeth set neat in a row. He turned it once in the firelight, then walked across the room and held it out. "Yours," he said, nothing more. Ellie looked at it as though it were something rare, not just cedar, carved by a carpenter's hand, but a gift without a bargain tied to it. Her fingers trembled when she reached for it. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Nathan only shrugged. "You don't have to." She traced the grain with the pad of her thumb, felt the weight of it settle in her palm, and swallowed hard. Gratitude pressed behind her ribs, but gratitude carried danger too. She had been taught that every kindness hid a cost, and yet he stood there, waiting for nothing, asking nothing, as though the giving itself had been enough. Later that evening, Nathan brought down a wooden chest from the shelf above his bed. The box was worn at the corners, the latch tarnished. He set it gently on the table and pushed it toward her. "My wife's," he said, voice low. She did mending. Ellie lifted the lid with careful fingers. Inside lay spools of thread in muted colors, scraps of fabric folded into neat squares, buttons saved in a tin. She stared for a long moment before touching anything, as though reaching into that box was trespassing into another woman's life. "I'll fix the dress right this time," she said finally, her voice so soft it barely carried across the room. Nathan nodded once. "You sew well?" She hesitated, then answered, "Well enough." He gestured lightly. "Then you can make use of it." The words were simple, but they struck her deeper than he likely knew. Not an order, not a demand. Permission, the kind she had not been given in years. She pulled the dress across her lap, threaded the needle, and set to work. Each stitch tightened the torn seam, each pass of the needle a way of holding herself together, along with the fabric. Nathan returned to his carving, this time shaping a smaller piece of wood into the beginnings of a drawer handle. But his eyes lifted now and then to where she sat bent over her work. He did not interrupt, only watched as the line of her shoulders eased with each stitch. The next morning, when she rose early to sweep the porch, Nathan brought her another shirt. This one had a tear across the shoulder seam. "Needs fixing," he said, handing it over. She took it with a small nod. The smell of him lingered in the fabric, wood smoke, sweat, pine resin, and for a fleeting moment she pressed it close before lowering her hands. She worked at the repair with diligence, patching the tear so fine the seam nearly vanished. When she handed it back to him, folded neat, he gave her a long look before setting it across the chair. "Good work," he said. She dropped her gaze, but inside something lifted. Not praise spoken with charm, not false sweetness, just steady acknowledgement that her hands had made something whole again. That night, when she sat by the fire brushing her hair with the cedar comb, Nathan watched without speaking. Her hair fell dark and long over her shoulders, smoother now, untangled for the first time in days. She felt his eyes on her but did not shrink. For once she let herself be seen. The brush caught and smoothed, until the weight of knots gave way. She thought of all the years she had carried shame in her silence, the way men had turned from her with impatience, the way she had been told again and again she was not enough. But here in the dim firelight, with cedar in her hand and his quiet gaze across the room, she felt the faintest stir of worth, not because he gave her things, but because those things carried no chain. They were tools, gifts of use, carved and offered not to bind but to steady. Nathan, for his part, found himself carving more than he had in months. The work had always been his way of keeping grief from rotting him hollow, shaping wood when he could not shape his life. But carving for her was different. The brush, the mending chest, the shirt handed for repair, all of it gave him reason to look past absence into presence. He had not thought to give another woman his wife's sewing box, not because he guarded it, but because he thought no one would ever sit at his table to use it again. Watching Ellie bend over thread and cloth, quiet but steady, he felt the room breathe in a way it hadn't, since fever stole the laughter from it. He did not speak of it, words were not his way, but his hands moved with a steadier rhythm, and the silence between them no longer carried only loss. By the end of the week, the cabin held signs of her in every corner. The repaired dress hung smoother against her frame. The shirt he wore carried her stitches at the shoulder. A new apron she had cut from the gray fabric swung from a peg by the door. None of it was spoken of, but he saw her fingers in every detail. She saw his in the brush she used each morning, in the steady firewood stacked by the hearth. They lived in quiet exchange, not of promises, not of debts, but of small, enduring gifts. And slowly, without either of them saying it aloud, those gifts became the first fragile proof of belonging. Not possession, not claim, just the steady building of a life where each gave what they could, and neither asked more than was offered. The nights in Nathan's cabin grew quieter, though not in the way of emptiness. The silence now carried weight, filled with the scrape of her needle and the whisper of his knife against wood, the low whistle he gave the fire when it burned too hot. Ellie found herself listening for those sounds, learning their cadence the way one learns a hymn. On the seventh evening, snow pressed thick against the panes and wind rattled the shutters like a hand knocking to be let in. She sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts with thread pulled from the box that had belonged to his wife, while he leaned over a plank at the table, sanding it smooth. The air between them was warm, even steady, but beneath it lived the unspoken, the shadows they both carried, the hurts neither had voiced. Ellie felt it first in her chest. The need to name herself before silence consumed her whole. She had carried words unspoken for years, swallowing them until they carved hollows inside her. But the longer she sat under his roof, the more it pressed against her ribs. She lifted her eyes, saw the curve of his shoulders bent over the plank, and before fear could stop her, she asked, "How long ago?" Nathan stilled, the rasp of sandpaper pausing. He didn't ask what she meant. He just answered, voice low, 3 years. Was it? Her words trailed, but he caught them. Fever. Late summer. It was quick. Ellie dropped her eyes back to the seam in her lap, the needle trembling slightly between her fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't say thank you, didn't look up, just set the plank aside and reached for another. It wasn't cold dismissal, only the plainness of a man who had lived with loss so long he no longer dressed it with words. His silence told her enough, that grief had carved him just as it had carved her, and maybe that was why the quiet between them didn't cut. She drew a breath, steadying her hands, then spoke again. "I was never married." Her voice was softer, almost like she was confessing a sin. "There was a man back in Ohio. A clerk, thought maybe, but I was too quiet for him. He said I was always watching, not doing enough." Nathan lifted his eyes then, steady across the firelight. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, just looked at her until her cheeks warmed under the weight of it. "Quiet don't mean weak," he said. The words landed heavy, heavier than any kindness she had been given in years. Ellie blinked fast, staring down at the thread in her lap. She had heard men call her quiet before, but always like a flaw, always like something broken inside her. Nathan said it plain, as if it were fact, as if silence itself was strength. Her throat tightened. She didn't trust her voice, so she kept sewing, each stitch steadier than the last. Nathan returned to his work, but his gaze lingered now and then, watching the way her shoulders shifted, the way her mouth pressed tight, as though holding back more. He had lived 3 winters without another soul in the cabin, and yet he recognized the shape of loneliness when it sat across the fire. He saw it in her lowered eyes, the way she curled inward as if braced for dismissal, and he hated that he knew exactly what that felt like. Later, as the fire burned low and the cabin fell to shadows, Ellie set her sewing aside. She lifted her hands to her lap, fingers raw from thread, and spoke without looking at him. "I thought I'd go back east if it didn't work. The matchmaker, she took what I had left." She swallowed hard. But there was nothing to go back to. Nathan leaned back in his chair. the firelight catching the scar along his collarbone. He didn't press her for more, didn't ask what had driven her to pay for a stranger's name. He only said, "I've seen worse men than the one who turned away." Ellie's lips trembled into a faint line. He didn't even ask me to speak. Just looked once and decided. Nathan's jaw shifted, but his voice stayed even. "Then he wasn't worth your speaking." The room fell quiet again, but not with shame. For the first time, Ellie felt her silence wasn't a wound to be hidden. It was simply part of who she was. She leaned back against the chair, her chest heavy but steadier. She hadn't told him everything. About the cousin who raised her, about the long years of work that led nowhere, but naming even a piece of it felt like loosening a knot that had strangled her breath. Nathan set his tools aside for the night. He rose, checked the fire, then looked at her again. His eyes were steady, not pitying, not searching, just seeing. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll keep the fire up." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Crawling into the bed near the stove, she pulled the quilt around her and let the warmth seep into her bones. Across the room, she heard him stoke the embers, the sound of his boots shifting on the floor. She closed her eyes, her heart still knotted, but not as tightly as before. And for the first time since stepping off the train, she didn't feel like silence was swallowing her whole. Instead, it felt like something shared. Two people, broken in different ways, naming only what they could bear, and leaving the rest to the steady rhythm of fire, wood, and breath. The days after that conversation carried a different kind of quiet. Not the hush of fear, not the hollowness of grief, but something slower, heavier, like a snowfall that softened every edge without erasing it. Ellie moved through Nathan's cabin with more steadiness in her step, though the wariness in her eyes hadn't faded entirely. She rose with the light, set the fire, brewed the coffee. He came in from the barn each morning, boots heavy with frost, and laid kindling by the stove before washing his hands at the basin. They didn't fill the air with words, but neither of them needed to. Their silences had begun to weave together, carrying meaning in the smallest of gestures. The way she folded his shirt smooth at the seams, the way he left half a biscuit wrapped in cloth on the table for her to find. One afternoon, the cold pressed hard enough to splinter the fence rail in the goat pen. Nathan called her to help. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked side by side, his stride long and even, hers careful but determined. The broken rail sagged low, the nails pulled clean loose. He steadied the beam while she held it in place, her hands stiff with cold, her breath steaming against the wood. When the hammer struck, the jolt traveled up her arms, but she didn't let go. He glanced at her once, saw the set of her jaw, and for the first time allowed himself to think she was stronger than she knew. By the time they finished, her fingers were numb. She nearly stumbled as they crossed the yard back toward the cabin, her boots slipping on ice, hidden beneath the powder. Nathan caught her by the elbow, his hand warm and firm even through the glove. She steadied, breath catching, but he didn't move away at once. He held her arm just long enough to know she wouldn't fall again. When she whispered, "I'm fine," his hand lingered a second longer before he let go. She carried the weight of that brief hold all the way inside, where the fire burned steady. Later that day, when the kettle boiled over and she rushed to lift it, her shoulder struck the corner of the shelf. She bit back a cry, her face tightening with pain. Nathan crossed the room in 2 steps. "Ma'am, you all right?" he asked, his hand already reaching toward her sleeve. She stiffened but didn't pull away as he lifted the fabric. The skin was red, tender but unbroken. His fingers rested lightly against her forearm, calloused at the tips but gentle in a way that startled her more than the bruise itself. Her breath hitched, not from hurt, but from the realization that a man's touch could steady instead of take. "You ought to slow down," he murmured, his eyes holding hers. "I was trying to help," she said quickly, voice trembling. "You already do." The words were plain, but they sank deep. He let her arm go, turned back to the stove as though nothing had shifted. But she stood there, sleeves still bunched at her elbow, and felt the air between them charged with something unspoken. That night she folded herself into the bed by the stove as always, but the space across the cabin no longer felt as far. She listened to the rhythm of his breathing, steady and near. In the dark, she whispered, "Thank you." His reply came low, just above the crackle of the fire. "You're welcome." She turned her face toward the wall, but her eyes closed, not with fear this time, but with something closer to ease. The next evening, as snow thickened against the windows, Nathan finished the cedar brush and placed it in her hands. She ran her fingers along its smooth handle. Then, before her courage could falter, she leaned forward and brushed her lips against his cheek. It was quick, tentative, but her hand trembled as she drew back. He didn't move, didn't speak, only stood there with her breath still warm on his skin. She folded her quilt that night with hands that shook, not from dread, but from the unknown of what she had just offered. The silence held, waiting. The following day, Nathan brought in feed from the barn while she mended by the fire. The air in the cabin seemed fuller, as though every movement carried weight. When evening came and she washed at the basin, he stepped outside to give her privacy. She returned to bed with her hair damp, falling loose around her shoulders. His shirt, offered days earlier, hung neatly folded on the chair. She slipped beneath the quilt, her heart loud in her ears, but when she glanced across the room, his back was turned, his movements slow and deliberate as ever. He left space. He always left space. On the 9th night, when wind battered the shutters, Nathan stoked the fire higher before lying down. Ellie lay awake, the quilt pulled to her chin, the words pressed against her lips before she could stop them. "I just want to stay," she whispered into the dark. His reply came steady, unwavering. "You can." Tears stung behind her eyes, but they did not fall. She turned onto her side, the sound of his breath grounding her like the beat of a drum. And for the first time since she stepped off that train, her body loosened against the mattress. The next morning, she woke with her hands still curled in the blanket, her heart calmer than it had been in weeks. Nathan had already gone to the barn, but the warmth of the fire he'd stoked before leaving lingered. She rose, smoothed her hair with the cedar brush, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that touch did not always carry a price. That sometimes it could mean safety, sometimes it could mean permission. And in that belief, she began to feel something she had almost forgotten: hope. The cabin's silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a room waiting to be lived in. Ellie noticed it first in the rhythm of her own steps, how she no longer crept, as if apologizing for every sound. When she swept the porch, she stood taller. When she mended, her stitches came quicker, steadier, and when she cooked, she hummed faint under her breath without realizing. Nathan noticed. He said nothing, but his eyes followed her with the same patience he gave to every board he planned, every hinge he mended. He had begun to look not at a guest passing through, but at someone who had already laid roots in the floorboards. At night, when the fire sank to coals, Ellie felt it too. The distance between their beds did not stretch as far anymore. His breathing, low and steady, reached her across the dark. And when the wind rattled the shutters, she did not startle as sharply as she had before. Once, in the middle of the night, when a branch snapped outside, she turned in half sleep and found his gaze already on her across the shadows. He didn't speak, didn't rise, only let his presence steady her. She closed her eyes and drifted again, the first time she had surrendered herself to rest without fear. It was a fragile piece, but it was enough to open space for something else. A slow turning toward him, not with boldness, but with the kind of trust that grows 1 inch at a time. She caught herself watching him work more openly, the curve of his shoulders as he bent to plane wood, the way his scar pulled faintly beneath his collar when he carried a beam. And when their hands brushed passing mugs or tools, she did not pull away so quickly. Once, she even let her fingers linger against his when he handed her a spool of thread. He looked at her then, longer than a glance, steadier than a politeness, and she felt her heart pound hard against her ribs. She did not drop her gaze this time. The turning point came quiet, as most things did with them. She was standing at the cupboard one evening, arranging the flour tin, when she dropped a spool that rolled across the floor. Nathan bent to catch it, and their hands met on the wood. She froze, thread clasped between them, her skin burning at the contact. He did not release it at once. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and the air between them shifted. Neither spoke, neither moved. Then, slow as thaw, she stepped closer, her hand rising to rest against his chest. The warmth of him pressed through his shirt, steady beneath her palm. He covered her hand with his own, not gripping, only holding it there as though it belonged. Her breath came uneven. "I don't know what you want from me," she whispered. His voice was low, steady as timber. "I don't want anything you're not ready to give." Her throat ached at the plainness of it. No demand, no barter, just space. Tears pricked behind her eyes. "I just want to stay," she managed. "You can." The words settled into her like fire, sinking deep into embers, warmth that would not burn out. She leaned forward then, kissed his cheek once more, slower this time, more certain. When she drew back, he didn't turn away. He only stood there as though she had given him something rare. That night when she lay down on her bed, her body did not coil as tightly. And when she woke near dawn to find his gaze on her across the room, she did not flinch. She closed her eyes again, letting herself believe in the safety of his steady watching. The following evening, the silence thickened with something new. They sat by the fire, she darning socks, he carving another handle. The air hummed, not with words, but with waiting. When she rose to set her sewing aside, the thread slipped from her fingers and rolled toward him. He reached to catch it. Their hands touched again, and this time she didn't hesitate. She looked at him wide-eyed but steady, and he set the thread aside slowly. She felt the pull of something larger than herself, and before she could second-guess it, she stepped close, lifted her hand once more to his chest, and rose on her toes. The kiss that followed was not tentative. It was quiet, slow, her lips soft and searching. Nathan kissed her back with the same steadiness he had carried into every act, careful, deliberate, reverent. He did not push, did not take. He only gave her back what she offered. Her breath trembled when they parted. But she did not retreat. Instead, she raised her hand to his jaw, traced the stubble with her thumb, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to be seen without shame. That night when she folded the apron across the chair and slipped beneath the quilt, She did not climb into her bed alone. Nathan stood at the threshold, waiting. "If you don't want to sleep alone," he said carefully, "I'll be all right with it. Just if you want to." She looked at him, her voice quiet but certain. "I do, but only if you let me decide how close I will." So she pulled back the quilt on his bed and lay down against the wall. He joined her, slow and cautious, leaving space between them. In the dark, she reached behind her and found his hand. He laced his fingers through hers, their palms pressed together steady. Nothing more. And in that silence, with his breath warm against her hair, Ellie finally slept not as a guest, not as someone waiting to be sent away, but as a woman who had chosen to stay. By the time the snow began to ease, the world outside the cabin had changed little, but inside, something had shifted in ways neither dared name. Ellie moved through the rooms, not as a stranger, careful of every step, but as a woman who had claimed space with her work, her silence, and now her choice to remain. The cedar brush rested on the shelf by her bed. Nathan's shirt hung mended and whole, and the apron she stitched swung from a peg near the door. She no longer hesitated to hum while she worked, nor to meet his eyes when she set a bowl of stew before him. Nathan, for his part, had begun to look at her less like someone he'd taken in for a night, and more like someone who had rooted herself deep into the grain of his life. And yet, the world beyond the cabin had not forgotten her. Dry Hollow still waited, with its platform, its whispers, and the truth of what she had once been, the girl too quiet, too plain, left standing where no one claimed her. It was Nathan who spoke first of going back. One morning, with frost glazing the windows but the road packed firm, he pulled on his coat and set the harness on the mules. "Storms let up, he said. "Road to town should be passable." Ellie froze, her hands still folded in the apron she was tying. The thought of Dry Hollow pressed hard against her ribs. The benches, the paint-peeled sign, the clerk's half-pitying glance. It all rose sharp in her memory. She had been left there once. To step back onto that platform now felt like daring the world to wound her again. But when Nathan said, "Need supplies?" and then more carefully, "You want to come?" she surprised herself by answering, "Yes." She spent that afternoon stitching the last hem on her dress, smoothing it with palms that trembled not from fear, but from resolve. Nathan brought down a heavier coat from his wife's things, its lining worn soft. "She'd have wanted it used," he said. Ellie slipped it over her shoulders, feeling its weight settle like both history and promise. The next morning, as the sun burned faint through thinning clouds, she stepped out beside him, bonnet tied neat, braid tucked smooth, her hands steady. He looked at her once, gave a small nod. "Ready?" She met his gaze. "I am." The wagon wheels bit through frost as they rode the long road down into town. The air was sharp, numbing her fingers even through gloves, but her spine stayed straight. Nathan sat beside her, reins loose in his gloved hands, his presence as steady as the mountains themselves. The closer they drew, the louder her heart beat. Dry Hollow rose gray and weathered from the snow, its storefronts leaning against one another like tired men. And there, as the wagon turned onto the main street, Ellie saw it, the depot. The same benches, the same boards, the same place where she had stood abandoned. Only this time, she was not standing. She was seated beside a man who had chosen not to turn away. Nathan stopped at the general store. He climbed down, then offered her his hand. She didn't hesitate. She placed her palm in his and let him steady her to the ground. His grip was firm, not possessive, but enough to anchor her as townsfolk began to notice. The clerk behind the counter paused, his wire-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose when his eyes shifted from Nathan to Ellie. His mouth opened, surprise caught between words. "You the mail order girl," he said, voice low. Ellie felt her throat tighten, but this time she did not look away. She lifted her chin, met his eyes, and answered, "I was." The words fell quiet but steady, carrying all the weight of rejection turned into survival. The clerk blinked, cleared his throat, and busied himself with shelves. No reply on his lips. Nathan set the list on the counter. "Feed, oil, thread, sugar, nails too, and a piece of fabric if you've got any left." His tone was matter-of-fact, leaving no space for questions. Outside, a woman paused on the post office steps, leaning close to whisper into another's ear. Ellie felt the eyes on her, the tilt of heads, the small, sharp hum of judgment carried by wind. Nathan ignored them, but Ellie did not. She stepped forward, her bonnet catching the sun, and said, clear and plain, "Good morning." The woman blinked, startled, then returned the greeting almost awkwardly. Ellie turned back toward Nathan, the bundle of supplies now resting in her arms. They walked side by side back to the wagon, not rushed, not hiding. As Nathan tied down the last of the bags, he glanced at her. "You all right?" She looked back at the street, at the platform that had once swallowed her whole, then back at him. "I think I am," she said softly. Then, after a pause, she added, "You." His eyes held hers for a moment, steady as ever. "You didn't have to speak to them," he said. "I wanted to." He gave her a long look, then nodded. "You're not the same woman who stood on that platform." Ellie lowered her eyes, then lifted them again with quiet resolve. "I'm still quiet," she said. Nathan reached out, tucked a strand of hair beneath her bonnet with a gentleness that steadied her heart. But not lost. The wagon carried them back up the ridge, the sun sliding behind them. Ellie held the brush in her lap, the cedar teeth catching her braid. Each turn of the wheels felt different now, not like running from rejection, but like returning from it. She had walked through the same town where she had been abandoned, but this time, with her head lifted, her hand steady, her voice her own. She was no longer the woman waiting to be chosen. She was a woman who had stayed. And Nathan, watching her from the corner of his eye as the mules pressed forward, felt a quiet certainty root itself in him too. Whatever came next, whether whispers or storms or the weight of memory, they would carry it side by side. And for the first time in years, he believed that was enough. Spring crept slowly into the bed of his, peeling back the layers of frost that had held the earth in silence. At Nathan's cabin, the snow shrank into rivulets that trickled past the porch steps, carrying pine needles and bits of bark down into the gullies. The air still bit at morning, but by midday the sun warmed the roof shingles enough to drip. Life returned in small ways. The chickens ranged farther from the coop. The goats pawed at patches of thawing soil. And the smell of cedar shavings lingered longer in the yard, where Nathan had begun planing boards again. Inside, Ellie moved with the quiet steadiness of someone no longer measuring each step against rejection. Her dress, once torn and ill-fitted, now hung smooth and strong, patched by her own hand. Her apron lay folded across the chair, her stitches clean along its hem. She belonged here, and not by accident. Nathan saw it in every corner. The curtain she had sewn now framed the window, softening the edges of his once plain cabin. The mending box sat open on the table, thread spools waiting for her hand. The brush he had carved rested near her bed, cedar teeth worn already by daily use. He had thought himself a man beyond renewal, carved hollow by grief, his days measured only in wood and work. But when he watched Ellie move through his cabin, tucking hair behind her ears, she bent to stir the pot, humming faint as she mended. He felt the strange, steady truth of it. His home was no longer his alone, and he did not want it to be. One evening, when the sun dropped copper across the ridge, Ellie stood at the stove, hands folded on the apron's ties. She turned to him, her voice low but certain. "I've been thinking," she said, "about staying. Not just being here, but really being here as your wife." Nathan paused at his bench, the plane resting silent against the wood. He lifted his head, his eyes steady. "Is that what you want?" She swallowed, her fingers tightening on the ties. "If you'll have me." He crossed the room in 2 steps, the scent of cedar clinging to his shirt. He cupped her cheek with his rough hand, thumb brushing the faint flush in her skin. "I already do." There was no ceremony, no witnesses, no vows shouted against the sky. Just 2 people standing in a cabin built from silence and loss, choosing one another without need of flourish. He bent his head, kissed her once, slow and reverent, and she leaned into him not with fear but with trust. The decision was not made in town by telegram or contract. It was made here, between them, with no one else to decide. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Nathan built a second dresser beside the bed, his hands shaping the drawers smooth, the wood fitted tight. Ellie stitched new curtains for the cabin window, pale fabric catching the light in a way that softened the room. They moved together with an ease that felt earned, not borrowed. Him carrying boards, her tending chickens, both of them laughing quietly once when the meanest hen pecked at her shawl, and Nathan muttered, "She don't like anyone." Ellie shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "She's just scared," she said. He looked at her then, a long glance that carried more weight than any words. By the time the snow melted into earth rich enough for planting, the truth of it had settled deep. Ellie was no longer the quiet girl left on the platform. She was Eleanor Gley, a woman who had stood, stayed, and chosen. Her silence was no longer a mark of weakness, but of strength, the kind that endures storms, the kind that bends without breaking. Nathan had found not just a companion, but a partner, someone who had filled the hollow of his cabin with the steady hum of belonging. They did not speak often of the past. The man who turned her away at the depot was never named again. His absence meant nothing now. What mattered was the way Nathan's boots stamped the porch at dawn, the way Ellie's hands folded bread dough with calm steadiness, the way their evenings ended side by the fire, silence no longer empty but full. One morning, as Nathan returned from the barn, he found her at the doorway, hair loose, eyes lifted toward the ridge. She turned to him, her voice quiet but sure. "Do you ever think about what people will say? About me? About us?" He set down the bucket of feed, wiped his hands against his coat. "Folks always talk. Don't matter much. What matters is you stayed." Her eyes softened, a faint smile curling. "I did." She reached for his hand, and he laced his fingers through hers, the same way he had that first night when she lay in his bed, trembling but unafraid. Only this time her grip was steady, her head lifted. By the end of spring, their lives had woven together into something neither had expected but both had chosen. The cabin, once a place of grief and silence, now stood as proof that even the most abandoned can find home. Nathan had thought love a thing buried with his wife. Ellie had thought belonging a thing forever denied her. Yet here they were, side by side, morning and night, no longer bound by what had been taken, but by what they had built. Every morning Ellie woke to the same sound, the fire already burning, the man she loved carrying wood in from the yard, his shoulders broad beneath the rising light. And every morning she knew the same truth, that staying was the most powerful choice either of them had ever made. There are cabins still standing in the Nevada hills, gray with age, their logs weathered smooth by wind and snow. You pass them sometimes, riding the ridges, and wonder who once kept a fire in those hearths. Some fell to ruin, their roofs caved and their chimneys leaning. But some hold on, solid as the day they were raised, because someone believed they were worth tending. Nathan Gley's cabin was one of those, built plain, lived in plain, but carrying a history that could not be measured in nails or cedar beams. Folks in Dry Hollow spoke of him the way they spoke of men who kept to themselves, respectful, curious, a little wary. They remembered the widower who lost his wife to fever, the carpenter who worked hard and asked for nothing. But seasons later, they also remembered the woman who rode into town beside him, bonnet neat, braid tucked, her hand steady in his. She had once been the mail-order bride no one wanted, left at the station, with nothing but a carpetbag and silence. They whispered about her at first, as townsfolk do. But whispers fade when a woman keeps her chin high and her steps steady. Over time, they stopped calling her the quiet girl. They started calling her Eleanor Gley. In that name lay something hard-earned. She had not married into a fortune, nor into ease. She had not been chosen by a man who looked at her once and decided she was enough. No, she had been rejected, cast aside, and still she had endured. And in that endurance, she had found a man who knew the language of silence as well as she did. Together they built a life, not out of promises shouted, but out of days lived steady, side by side. The truth of the frontier was always this: not everyone found their place. Many were broken by it, bent under the weight of loss, of hunger, of loneliness. But sometimes, in the harshest stretches of land, two people met not by plan but by chance. And in that meeting, something took root that could outlast the winter. Nathan and Eleanor were one such story. He had carried grief like a stone in his chest. She had carried shame like a chain around her throat. And yet, through small acts, a bowl of stew, a mended seam, a carved brush, a hand held in the dark, they had loosened what once bound them. There was nothing dramatic in the way they lived afterward. They planted a garden come spring, kept the goats, raised hens that pecked as mean as ever. Nathan built furniture for neighbors when asked. Eleanor stitched aprons and curtains that lasted years. Their love was not loud. It did not need to be. It was in the way he always left half a biscuit warm in his pocket for her, in the way she always brushed his coat free of sawdust before hanging it by the door. It was in the silence they shared by the fire, silence that no longer weighed heavy but settled easy. And so the cabin stood, year after year, its porch swept clean, its windows curtained, its hearth burning steady. Some said you could feel it when you stepped inside, that the walls carried a kind of quiet, different from loneliness. The kind of quiet that comes when two people have chosen to stay, not because they had no other road, but because they wanted none. That is the legacy of Eleanor Gley. Not the story of the girl left at the station, but of the woman who stayed. And it is the legacy of Nathan Gley. Not the story of the widower who turned inward, but of the man who learned to open his door again. Their names may not be written in ledgers or carved on plaques, but in every board of that cabin, in every seam of fabric patched and worn, in every fire lit against the winter cold, their choice still lingers. Because on the frontier, survival was one kind of strength, but staying, truly staying, was another. And for Nathan and Eleanor, that was enough.